Okie doke, there we go. We're recording again. So this evening, we're going to take a look at Rabban Gamliel. And before we launch into anything about his life or his historical context, it's going to become necessary immediately to do a little bit of disambiguation, because there are a couple of Rabban Gamliels. And to explain why that is, I've prepared a little chart. Let me see here. Okay, so here's the situation. There is an important lineage of Tannaitic sages descending from Hillel the Elder, who all served as Nasi during the Tannaitic period. So this is a family tree, in fact. So there's Hillel the Elder, you'll remember from our second class, right? He was paired up with Shammai, one of the last pair of Zugot. So anyway, Hillel was the Nasi of his day, and Shammai was supposedly the Av Beit Din. Hillel had a son who was known in the tradition as Rabban Shimon ben Hillel, who also served as Nasi. Shimon ben Hillel's son, Rabban Gamliel the Elder, also served as the Nasi. And he was the Nasi pretty much right prior to, actually, in adjusting my thing, my little label got switched around. So Hillel the Elder was Nasi. After that, his son, Rabbi Shimon ben Hillel. After him, Rabban Gamliel the Elder, who was his son. And then Gamliel the Elder, he was the father of Rabban Shimon, who is the grandson of the original Rabban Shimon, who we're calling Rabban Shimon ben Hillel. Rabban Shimon was the Nasi during the period immediately leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple, right? And at least according to some historical traditions, some documentation, there's some suggestion that Rabban Shimon was involved in some way, shape, or form with the rebellion and may have been put to death by the Romans. Rabban Gamliel, the Rabban Gamliel that we're concerned about, is maybe in our terminology more properly known as Rabban Gamliel II, and he is the son of Rabban Shimon. And he becomes the Nasi of the Sanhedrin once the Sanhedrin moves to Yavne after the destruction of the second temple. Subsequently, his son, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, is going to become the Nasi after him, and he is the father of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, otherwise known in the tradition as Rabbi, as the Rabbi. So you'll be noticing a lot of Rabbans here, right? Rabban isn't the name of these individuals, right? Their names are this seemingly endless succession of Shimons and Gamliels, right? Those are the actual names of the individuals in question. Rabban here appears to be it's a term that means our Rav, our teacher. And it appears to have attached specifically to the line of sages in this family tree between Hillel the Elder and Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, all of whom belonged to this family line, and all of whom served as the Nasi, which, if you'll recall from our from a couple of previous classes, Nasi is the title that refers to the president or chief of the Sanhedrin, the sort of grand rabbinic court that serves as the highest authority in the realm of Jewish law. So, okay, all of which is to introduce our fellow, Rabban Gamliel. who's serving as Nasi of the Sanhedrin after the destruction of the Second Temple. So a brief note then about the Sanhedrin and the title of the Nasi that he takes on. After the temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin, which used to meet in Jerusalem, is reestablished in Yavne, which, if you'll recall, is the location of the Rabbinic Academy that was established by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai with the permission of the Emperor Vespasian. Vespasian also gave his permission for relocating the Sanhedrin to Yavne. And the head of the Sanhedrin was granted a kind of official recognition from the Roman government with the authority to pronounce on religious matters among the Jewish community. It's pretty clear that Vespasian's willingness to grant this recognition is due primarily to the fact that the Pharisees, of whom, remember, Yochanan ben Zakkai is sort of the sage who's the leader of the Pharisees in his day, the Pharisees had not been particularly much involved in the Great Revolt, right? That had been primarily other groups who were around in the Jewish world at that time. But the Pharisees had generally remained out of it, right? They had advised the heads, the leaders of the Zealots, not to rebel against Rome, because most of the Pharisees' leaders felt or understood that the Romans could really not be defeated by the Jews at that time, and so they'd stayed out of the revolt. Yochanan ben Zakkai had smuggled himself out of the city. And Vespasian then is more well-disposed toward the Pharisees than to any other Jewish group. And so he lends them this sort of recognition of allowing them to reestablish the Sanhedrin with the Nasi at the head of it. And the Nasi then has a kind of recognition as sort of the head, more or less, of the Jewish community in the Roman Empire. He has, therefore, a certain amount of secular authority that goes along with his religious authority. In general, this sort of de facto sanction by the Roman government is probably one factor among many in how the rabbinic successors to the Pharisees become the authoritative voice in matters of Jewish religion after the temple's destruction, right? For one thing, many of the other key Jewish groups at the time were more or less wiped out in the revolt, right? Because they were the ones who were participating in the rebellion. And also, the Pharisees had a certain amount of sanction from the Romans, which gave them a certain amount of authority when it came to holding forth on what was authoritatively Jewish practice in the period after the Second Temple was destroyed. I'm bringing all of this up mainly to provide context for a key element of Rabban Gamliel's life and his work, which is apparent in a number of the stories that we find about him in the Talmud. And this is this situation where in his capacity as Nasi, as the head of the Sanhedrin, Rabban Gamliel worked tirelessly toward a unification of halachic practice among the rabbis. A unification which went according to a simple principle of majority rule, right? The general agreement among the rabbis in this sort of newly developing rabbinic community that centered at first in the town of Yavne is the principle that whatever the majority of the sages agree to, that is the halakha. There are minority opinions, but ultimately everything goes according to majority opinion in terms of the authoritative halakhic practice. There have been a number of stories that have been preserved in the rabbinic literature which illustrate how Rabban Gamliel went to great lengths to enforce this principle of majority rule. And sometimes to an extent that he kind of stepped over the line and ended up humiliating important rabbis whose opinions weren't necessarily in accord with the majority of the sages on particular issues of halakha. So I'm just going to give you one example of this. For starters, there's a story told of how a particular student who came and asked Rabbi Yehoshua, who was a contemporary of Rabban Gamliel's, whether the evenings, whether the Amidah, the standing prayer in the evening, is obligatory or optional. Rabbi Yehoshua answered that it's optional. You can do that prayer, but you don't have to. So the same student went to Rabban Gamliel and asked him the same question. But Rabban Gamliel said, the evening Amidah is mandatory. The student replied, but didn't Rabbi Yehoshua tell me that it's optional? So now that Rabban Gamliel knew that Rabbi Yehoshua was holding a different opinion when it came to the obligatory nature of the evening prayer, the next day in the Beit Midrash, Rabban Gamliel took Rabbi Yehoshua to task by essentially making him stand up while Rabban Gamliel sat and taught for that day's lesson. This was regarded as such an insult to Rabbi Yehoshua that it actually sparked a major protest among the rest of the sages. And the result was that Rabban Gamliel was removed for some time from the office of Nasi, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was appointed to Nasi in his place. So eventually Rabban Gamliel made up with Rabbi Yehoshua and appeased him, apologized for his behavior. And he, Rabban Gamliel, was reinstated. But for the rest of his time as Nasi, he had to share the post with Rabbi Elazar. Rabban Gamliel still had the sort of the higher position, but Rabbi Elazar would sort of fill in on a sort of rotating basis as the lecturer in the Beit Midrash. So I bring up this story because it illustrates a key values conflict that seems to have been going on in early Rabbinic Judaism. The need for unity, right, for establishing some kind of collective identity and collective stance as the rabbis, right, in order to cement rabbinic authority, versus the importance of mutual respect, even among those who vehemently disagree. And this basic conflict seems to have been a real issue among the rabbis throughout the rabbinic period, the period of the Mishnah and the Gemara. One of the really interesting things about rabbinic culture is the way in which the rabbis consider shaming or humiliating another person to be a tremendous sin, right? They place a tremendous importance on honor and respect that is due to a person. And as a result, they consider shaming or humiliating a person to be essentially tantamount to murder. The way that the rabbis put it is that someone might be guilty of the sin of halbanat panim, of whitening a person's face by humiliating them in public, right? Part of the reason why the reaction to Rabban Gamliel's treatment of Rabbi Yehoshua in this case that we presented in the story that I just mentioned, the reason that response was so extreme is because of the high degree of importance on honor and the high degree of concern about shame that existed in rabbinic culture. And because of that, it was always an issue in rabbinic culture how to engage in debate, which could oftentimes be extremely spirited, right? The rabbis would often could often develop pretty intense rivalries, and the disagreements over the halacha frequently got pretty intense. And there's a high degree of importance placed on winning in a debate. But at the same time, there's this countervailing balance. There's this balancing value of not putting another rabbi to shame, right? And the question of where is the line and how to avoid crossing over, and also the concern about what the consequences might be when that line is crossed, was something that was of deep concern to the rabbis of the Tannaitic period and on into the period of the Gemara. So yeah, and Rabban Gamliel was in some respects kind of an instigator in this regard, right? He ended up being the flashpoint of a number of difficult episodes in the history of the early rabbinic community, precisely because of the way in which he was trying to sort of consolidate rabbinic power and authority among the Jewish people, while also having to manage the kind of fractious and kind of debate-prone, rabbis themselves. All of this is happening in a context that is not closed off to the outside world, right? There's a lot of what's going on among the rabbis that is pretty much of interest only to the rabbis. But at the same time, right, the rabbis themselves are the focus of at least some amount of attention, because they have been sort of set up now as the leaders of the Jewish world, at least the Jewish world under the Roman Empire, which was a significant part of the Jewish world at the time. And so the rabbis, are simultaneously having to focus their attention inward in terms of figuring out what the halacha, what Jewish religious practice is going to look like in this new world that the Jews are now having to live in, but also have to be looking outward and have to have concern for for what's going on in the world outside of the academy, right? Because so much of the conditions in which they have to live, right, is determined by the Roman government and by their relationship to the Romans and to the other peoples who are also living under Roman rule. There's a number of stories in the Talmud that depict the precariousness of Rabban Gamliel's position of quasi-authority under the Romans. The Roman stance toward Jews and Judaism was liable to shift at a moment's notice, and the results of that could ultimately be catastrophic for the Jews. There's a story that tells of how Rabban Gamliel traveled to Rome along with Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Akiva to request the annulment of a decree that threatened the existence of the Jewish people. When they returned from Rome, the government sent 2 officers disguised as Jews to find out what their Torah is like. In other words, to find out what what kind of doctrine or ideology was being taught in this rabbinic academy. And according to the story, these spies studied scripture and Mishnah and Midrash with Rabban Gamliel and ultimately concluded that the Torah was fitting and praiseworthy, right? This is just one illustration of the way in which what's going on in the academy is not of concern just to the Jewish community, but also is of concern outside of the Jewish community. And what's going on among the Jews is a subject of at least some concern for the Roman government, right? Who, remember, had only recently managed to put down a fairly major revolt against Roman rule in that part of the empire, and were extremely concerned to ensure that that kind of rebellion didn't happen again, right? So when the Roman officials are sent to find out about the Torah, what they're actually probably being like, what's actually probably going on in practical terms, right, is what the governors really want to know is, are these people actually accepting Roman rule now, right? Or are we going to end up facing another Jewish revolt in a couple of years, right? It's a politically charged atmosphere, in other words, and also one in which you've got a lot of different ethnic, religious, and philosophical groups that are all living, under the same empire, right? And sometimes there's conflict between the groups that is played out in terms of one group's jockeying for position and favor vis-a-vis the Roman government against that of their neighbors, right? There's a number of stories of Rabban Gamliel having public debates with philosophers and with minim, which is a term that refers to Jewish heretics, people who endorsed religious views that weren't approved by the rabbis. And so there's an important aspect of this role of the Nasi to serve as the face of Judaism to the public in a religiously and ethnically diverse society in which all these different groups are ruled over by the Roman Empire, and in which it was occasionally advantageous for one group to sort of garner favor with the Romans by denouncing another group. So it's a complicated world that Rabban Gamliel is living in and trying to serving in as a member, as a leader of the community. And I think his position really illustrates something about the difficult and complicated nature of Jewish leadership in conditions of empire, right? There's a lot of power that comes with the position of Nasi during this time, right? Rabban Gamliel has a great deal of power over his fellow rabbis and over the Jewish community as a whole. But at the same time, he's subject to the authority of Roman rule, right? And part of his job is as mediator between the Jews and the Romans, and also between the Jews and other groups of people. And this is, I think, never an easy position to be in, right, of having to mediate between different groups. And it's a particularly difficult position to be in, I think, in this period immediately after the destruction of the Second Temple, because at that point, right, the deck is already very much stacked against the Jews, right? The Romans there's maybe a tendency among the Roman government to be suspicious of a group of people who's responsible for one of the worst rebellions that they've had to put down in the empire. I've got another story that I want to bring in at some point, but I want to kind of open it up here for kind of questions and comments about Rabban Gamliel as we've presented him so far. I don't want to take this up totally with my talking. So I do have a text we can kind of explore in a little bit, but I want to first open it up for some comments. Sharon.
How I'm trying to understand how big geographically would Rabban Gamliel's power have extended over Jews, because Yavne is still a small place and kind of in a backwater. It's not like the Middle Ages where, a rabbi could communicate all over. Would this have just been Palestine, or would it have been already to Babylonia and North Africa?
So still at this point, right, Palestine and, originally Jerusalem, right, particularly, is a key religious and cultural center for the Jewish diaspora in the ancient Mediterranean, right? There exists a Jewish community in Babylon that is pretty significant in terms of population. There exists a Jewish community in Egypt, particularly in Alexandria, which also is pretty significant in terms of population. And we know a little bit about the Jewish community in Alexandria, and what we know about them, incidentally, is that they had a number of cultural and religious practices that were a little different from from folks in Eretz Yisrael. One of the key aspects of that was that apparently the Alexandrian Jews considered it acceptable to read Torah in Greek translation, and considered that a valid form of public Torah reading in ways that the Jews in Palestine would not have accepted at all. Right? It made perfect sense, though, for the Alexandrian Jewish community, because all of them spoke Greek as their natural language, and Hebrew wouldn't have come as naturally to them, right? But even though there are other population centers throughout the Roman Empire of Jews, Eretz Yisrael is still the center, right? It has a tremendous amount of hold over the minds and hearts of the Jewish people, in much the same way that Israel does for many Jews today, right? I think probably even more so in that the center of Jewish scholarship and learning, right, was still in that part of the world, right? There will eventually develop a significant academy culture in Babylon, for example. We know this, but that had not really arisen to the level that it would in the period of the Amoraim. And so at this point, when it comes to looking for Torah, it's still very much a center periphery kind of model, right? Wherein Jewish people from the diaspora who wish to learn Torah must go to the source, and that involves physically traveling to Eretz Yisrael, right? So for that reason alone, just the existence of the Rabbinic Academy in Yavne would have served as an important cultural magnet in terms of drawing minds to it, right? And spreading its ideas outward. Also, because the Romans recognized the Sanhedrin as continuing to exist and having a certain amount of religious authority, right? That Sanhedrin was an important, like, conservative element of cultural conservation, right? Jews had generally regarded the Sanhedrin as a court that had spiritual and temporal authority over Jewish people, right? And whose judgments were understood to be official. And that the fact that the Sanhedrin at least could claim continuity from the Sanhedrin that met, in Jerusalem, right, gave it that kind of cultural cachet that was very important in terms of maintaining rabbinic authority, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a number of key tools or weapons that the rabbis of Yavne have under in their hands that enable them to exert cultural authority over the broader Jewish community. But it's also the case, right, that they probably have considerably more direct authority within the immediate sphere of influence than they do outward into the periphery, right, where probably there's more room, for example, in Alexandria for the Jewish community to continue operating on according to practices that may not have been recognized by the sages in Yavne as authoritative, and that would have been, not so difficult for that community because it was so far removed from Eretz Yisrael, right? Not that far removed, right? We're still talking about comparatively a small geographic space, right? Compared to the vastness of the diaspora in the modern world, right? Where Jews live in Europe, where Jews live in Asia, where Jews live in the United States, where Jews live in South America, right? But nevertheless, we're still talking about a fairly, like, by the standards of the time, we're talking about a fairly far-flung group of communities. And almost certainly one would imagine that the authority of the Sanhedrin to pronounce about what is correct and incorrect Jewish practice would have been more heavily felt within the immediate geographical radius of where they were in Yavne, as opposed to in Babylon or in Alexandria. Dan, I think I see a hand up over there.
So you sort of awakened my awareness of Babylon.
Mhm.
Is this a community that existed as a living community since the time of Ezra? And if so, did they must have developed traditions of their own, like Alexandria, which we don't hear about.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, and this is an area where most of the standard histories that that you'll find are not particularly, like, don't have a whole lot to say about it. There had existed a Jewish community of some size in Babylonia for quite some time, probably, ever since almost certainly, basically the way it would have worked, right, is that, anytime a group of people moves, right, not everybody is going to go. Right? Some people stay behind unless there's, some sort of horrible disaster that's causing everybody to leave. So in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, right, many of the Jewish exiles went back to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the temple, but some of them stayed behind, right, and maintained their community in Babylon because they had put down roots there, right? It's a very old story. That community does not have a huge amount of historical weight and significance during the Second Temple period, right? It's just sort of part of the diaspora, right? The center is Jerusalem. And that generally was the case for as long as the temple stood, right? The temple and the Sanhedrin both had this tremendous cultural gravity, right? That made everything revolve around them, at least in the Jewish world, right? It's only with the destruction of the temple that gravity starts to dissipate, right? And we start to see a general sort of movement toward the increasing significance of these other communities. But that's a process that takes time, right? At least during the period that we're looking at right now, the Tannaitic period, it was still the case that there are Jews in Babylon who consider Rabbinic Judaism to be their approach to Judaism, right? But Jews who want to study Torah, right, aspiring scholars from Babylon, basically do what Rabbi Hillel did, right? If you recall, Rabbi Hillel was born in Babylon, but he moves to Eretz Yisrael because he wants to learn Torah, right? Because that's where you go to learn Torah, at least at that time. And that continued to be the case for quite a while, right? Up until the Amoraic period, when, and we'll be getting into this a little bit, in other classes, right, as we kind of move further along the timeline, right? But the basic situation is, as conditions get worse and worse for Jews in the Roman Empire, right, due to Roman persecution, the cultural center of gravity slowly shifts over into Babylon, where it is comparatively safer for the Jews when the Romans are persecuting the Jews under their control. And as that happens, the academies in Babylon gain more and more significance and more cultural weight until we get to the period of the Gaonim, when really they are, like, the Babylonian academies have become the center of the Jewish world. And the Palestinian academies, they still exist, but they're much less culturally significant, right? But that's a slow historical shift that's still happening through the Amoraic period. at this particular time, even with the destruction of the temple, right, the significance of Eretz Yisrael is so powerful for the Jewish people that most Jews are still looking toward Eretz Yisrael for Torah, right, for learning about what it is to be Jewish, right, what it is to be authentically Jewish, right, because they're used to thinking of Eretz Yisrael as the place where the Torah is purest, where Jewish life is the Jewiest, right? And it's going to take a while for conditions to get so bad under the Romans in that part of the world that that sense of, everything that we need to know about being Jewish, we have to look toward Eretz Yisrael, that starts to kind of dissipate somewhat, and the Babylonian academies start to develop more centrality in the Jewish mind.
That sort of led to another question. I always wondered why the Palestinian Talmud is so much smaller than the Bavli, and does that have anything to do with this, or am I off on another tangent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason is that the Talmud Yerushalmi is completed some 200 years before the Bavli is, right? Which means that the Bavli has about 200 years more to cook, right? And the reason for that probably has to do with the fact that things were getting progressively worse and worse for the Jews in the Roman province of Palestina, right? Which made it more and more difficult to maintain a high degree of standards when it came to the scholarly work of the academies, right? Yeah. But even so, right, until very, very, very late in the Amoraic period, it was still considered by the Babylonians to be sort of a cultural ideal or value that the Torah was purer in Eretz Yisrael, and that if you really wanted to know Torah, you had to go to Eretz Yisrael and learn from the Palestinian rabbis. The thing is that just as we got further and further into the Amoraic period, that became less and less sincere on the part of the Babylonian rabbis, right? It was sort of a pious thing that they said, but in practice, you got to the point where, at some point in the Amoraic period, we start having elements of Babylonian practice that start taking precedence over the practice, the halakha as it was practiced in Eretz Yisrael. And when that starts happening, you can kind of see that as sort of a turning point that represents like a big cultural shift in terms of where the cultural weight of the Jewish people is by that point.
Rabbi, could you please put the genealogical line in the chat, please?
Yeah, you bet. Oh, wait, I don't think I can put it in the chat. I can share it out to folks after the class is done.
Okay, that would be fine, yeah.
But I'd be happy to put it back up on the screen for a minute here.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to be able to print it out. So if you could share the email after the class, that would be great.
Oh yeah, I'll put it in PDF and send it out. Right.
Great, thank you.
Good.
I do actually want to go back to my screen share though, because I wanted to share another piece of text here that speaks to this kind of issue about halachic centralization and the rule of the majority versus the concern for not dishonoring the holders of a minority opinion. There's a very famous story that we in the progressive Jewish world in particular are always revisiting. The story of the oven of Achnai, right? We come back to it quite a lot in the progressive Jewish world. The thing is that usually the story that we tell, right, is all about the first half of the story. But the second half of the story is very much, the first half of the story to begin with is very much about establishing this ideal of majority rule among the rabbis. But it's the second half of the story that really illustrates the cultural issues that the early rabbinic community had around shame and shaming another person and what the consequences of that might be. So just to kind of refresh people's memories, the story in question has to do with a particular halakhic question concerning whether it was possible to make an oven ritually impure under a very specific set of conditions, in which the oven is essentially sliced into horizontal slices, and the individual slices are separated by a layer of sand. The question is, can such an oven become impure, or is it impossible to make impure? And there's a difference of opinion here. Rabbi Eliezer says that oven is pure, and the rest of the sages disagree, and they say it's impure. Okay? So the story goes, right, that there's this debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the rest of the rabbis. And Rabbi Eliezer provides all sorts of arguments and justifications for why he's right, and the rabbis keep turning him down. They wouldn't accept his arguments. So eventually Rabbi Eliezer gets frustrated, and he starts calling on essentially the forces of nature to back up his argument, right? He says, if the halakha is in accordance with my opinion, let the carob tree prove it. And so the carob tree gets up, picks up its roots, and walks a distance away and plants itself back down. But the rabbis don't accept that argument, because one doesn't accept halakhic rulings from a carob tree. So then he says, right, if the halakha is in accordance of opinion, let the water of the river demonstrate that I'm right. And so the waters of the river turn backwards and they flow the other way. But of course, we don't accept halakhic arguments from water either. So then Rabbi Eliezer points to the Beit Midrash, right, the house of study, and he says, let the walls of the house of study demonstrate that I'm correct. And so the walls of the house of study start collapsing. At this point, Rabbi Yehoshua scolds the walls and tells them to stand back up, because it is none of the walls' affair. It's a debate among the rabbis, and the walls need to, to respect, right? Finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, if the halakha is according with me, then heaven itself will prove it. And so a bat kol, a divine voice, comes down and says, what are you talking about? Everything is in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer. It's at this point that Rabbi Yehoshua, remember, this is the same Rabbi Yehoshua that was shamed by Rabban Gamliel, and that got Rabban Gamliel into such trouble. This is the same Rabbi Yehoshua. He stands up and says, it is written in Deuteronomy, it is not in heaven. The Torah is not in heaven. In other words, the Torah came from God, but ultimately it's been handed over to human beings to interpret. And ultimately, the principle that the rabbis have determined to be the principle that like how we interpret it is that we go according to majority rule, right? So this ultimately was considered to be the clincher to the argument. The oven was declared impure. And at this point, the story kind of shifts, right? This is the point, that's the end of the story as we usually tell it, with God laughing and saying, my children have overcome me, right? It's kind of a happy ending in that regard. But the rest of the story isn't so happy. Because here's what happens next. The sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer, and they burned them in a fire. And the sages reached a consensus in this regard, and the translation here is they ostracized him. They subjected him to karet. They excommunicated Rabbi Eliezer. There's a concern here about how they break the news to Rabbi Eliezer. So the sages say, who's going to go and inform him that he's been excommunicated? Rabbi Akiva, who is a disciple of Rabbi Eliezer, says to them, I will go, lest an unseemly person go and inform him in a callous and offensive manner, and he would thereby destroy the entire world. All right, so this is when we kind of jump in. Who can volunteer to read for me here for this paragraph?
What did Rabbi Akiva do?
Yeah.
Okay. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain, and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, which is the distance that one must maintain from an ostracized individual. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what is different about today from other days that you comport yourself in this manner? Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. He employed euphemism as actually they distanced Rabbi Eliezer from them. Rabbi Eliezer too rent his garments and removed his shoes, as it is the custom of an ostracized person, and he dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground.
Right. So
Okay.
Eliezer is having a tremendous emotional response to this because he has been excommunicated and shamed by his fellow rabbis.
Yes, he tore his clothes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Who wants to read next? Sure.
The Gemara relates, his eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, and 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley. And some say even the dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. The sages taught there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned.
Can you continue with the next paragraph for us?
And even Rabban Gamliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at Yavne, the head of the sages who were responsible for the decision to ostracize Rabbi Eliezer, was coming on a boat at the time, and a large wave swelled over him and threatened to drown him. Rabban Gamliel said, it seems to me that this is only for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Heranicus, as God punishes those who mistreat others. Rabban Gamliel stood on his feet and said, Master of the universe, it is revealed and known before you that neither was it for my honor that I acted when ostracizing him, nor was it for the honor of the house of my father that I acted. Rather, it was for your honor, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel. In response, the sea calmed from its raging.
Okay, thanks. So things are getting a little hairy for Rabban Gamliel, but he's at least able to calm the sea. Can I get someone to volunteer to read the last couple of paragraphs for us? How about you, Sharon?
The Gemara further relates, Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was the sister of Rabban Gamliel. From that incident forward, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to lower his head and recite the Tachanun prayer, which includes supplication and entreaties. She feared that were her husband to bemoan his fate and pray at that moment, her brother would be punished. A certain day was around the day of the new moon, and she inadvertently substituted a full 30-day month for a deficient 29-day month. In other words, she thought that it was a new moon, but one does not lower his head in supplication, but it was not. Some say that a pauper came and stood at the door, and she took bread out to him. The result was that she left her husband momentarily unsupervised. Shall I finish?
Yeah, sure.
When she returned, she found him and saw that he had lowered his head in prayer. She said to him, arise, you already killed my brother. Meanwhile, the sound of the shofar emerged from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that the Nasi had died. Rabbi Eliezer said to her, from where did you know that your brother would die? She said to him, it is a tradition that I received from the house of the father of my father. All the gates of heaven are apt to be locked, except the gates of prayer for the victims of verbal mistreatment.
So there's a lot going on in this story.
Yeah.
At least one component of which, right, is this idea that the rabbis have that ultimately, right, verbal mistreatment, right, shaming and humiliating of another person is so significant that, as it were, God's ears are much more open to the prayers of someone who's been the victim of such an experience than to virtually anything else, right? And the results of that can be significant and tragic, as in the case here of the death of our guy, Rabban Gamliel. So what are people's thoughts on this story? What's coming up for you as we read this?
Well, I'm thinking that they are aware that embarrassment can lead to and shaming can lead to so much else, ongoing resentment, feuds, everything.
Yeah.
That it is opening such a rift that you have to be extraordinarily careful. And it seems to me that explains why the Talmud, in the farm that we know at the Bavli, goes to such great pains to post the minority opinions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Sharon. Like what we're seeing here in these stories is the underlying social reasons that led to the growth of this cultural mores that we find in rabbinic literature of preserving the minority opinion, oftentimes to a really remarkably detailed degree, right? Not because, and this is what we need to remember as progressive Jews, right? Is for us, this is incredibly useful because it often provides us with alternate paths for kind of reworking our understanding of Jewish practice. But probably that wasn't the intent of the rabbis who were preserving these opinions. For them, they were perfectly comfortable with the idea that the halakha was in accordance with the majority. For them, though, there was a strong reason for preserving the minority of opinion that had very much to do with honoring everyone, right? Even if that person's that person's halakhic opinion did not end up being the accepted halakha, nevertheless, it was important for them to preserve it for the sake of kavod, for the sake of the rabbi's honor, and for the sake of not submitting them to shame and humiliation, which was considered to be a terrible kind of suffering to inflict on a person.
What's kind of funny, I'm thinking, is that after doing about 3 or 4 years with Rabbi Fine, his beginning Talmud course, we'd come across all the time these very lengthy, the point that says this is this, but some people say, and then they give you this long other opinion, which sounds perfectly reasonable. And you say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then it says, and at the very end, after you said, yeah, this sounds real reasonable, the last line will say, but the opinion goes the other way.
Exactly.
So it's like you're still honoring the other opinion by talking about it.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, okay, so in delving into this aspect of Rabban Gamliel, the ways in which he either intentionally or unintentionally caused shame and humiliation sometimes in pursuit of his goal of uniting the rabbinic academy around a shared conception of halakha, I don't want to leave us with the impression that he was just a total unmitigated jerk. So before we finish up tonight, I want to share just a couple of pieces of tradition about Rabban Gamliel's softer side. So here's a couple of things. First, it's said of him that he greeted the other sages with a friendly countenance, and that at his son's wedding, despite the fact that he was apparently a very wealthy man, he personally served the drinks to the guests. Furthermore, there's a study of how a woman in his neighborhood used to weep every night for her son who had died. And it's said that Rabban Gamliel would cry whenever he heard her, and he wept so much that his eyelashes fell out. So apparently he could be a very passionate person. And it seems to be maybe a suggestion there that when he makes these statements, as for example he made in his speech to God on the ship in the story we just read, about how he's not doing these things for his own honor, but for the sake of preventing the Jewish community from kind of devolving into strife and dissension, that he's probably saying something that for him at least is true, right? That ultimately he's doing this for reasons that have to do with his conception of what Israel needs in his time, right? and not for the sake of causing humiliation, even if ultimately that seems to have sometimes been, what actually did happen.
I'm thinking this is a problem for all honest judges,
Mm.
that they may have to make decisions that they do not like, because it's the just decision, even if, and you'd hope more judges would be that way, that they would that they would do what is the correct thing, even if it's not personally what appeals to them.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the tremendous difficulty of being a judge when it is your own community that you have to pass judgment over, right? Because these rabbis, because these rabbis are an incredibly close-knit community in which there are strong interpersonal connections, right? Notice from our story from Baba Metzia that Rabban Gamliel's sister was the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, right? It was that their families were that closely connected, right? And nevertheless, you had this situation that arose between these two rabbis for that reason, right? So it's a very complex community, right? In which people are making decisions for political, social, and religious reasons, but in which those decisions can sometimes have tremendous personal consequences. All right, we're getting kind of toward the end of our time here, but I wanted to leave it open if anyone had any questions or last thoughts that they wanted to share before we finish up, particularly folks who maybe haven't had a chance to speak yet or
I wanted to know if we're going to hear more about Rabbi Yehoshua and or Rabbi Akiva during any of our talks here, because those guys did a lot of stuff too.
Oh yeah, well, we're definitely going to be learning more about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehoshua, I'm not sure yet. We may end up doing. We may end up looking at him, although I need to delve a little deeper and see whether whether there's so much more to talk about him that isn't kind of touched on in our discussion of Rabban Gamliel. But yeah, definitely Rabbi Akiva, though. Maybe Rabbi Yehoshua too. We'll see. Yeah. All right, folks. In that case, I think we're going to finish up here for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for being here and part of our class tonight. And as usual, this will be up on YouTube. I'm going to stop recording now.